It's with great pleasure that today we've reached the point in this series where I'm going to be taking a look at one of my all-time favourite superheroes, Spider-Man. When I was growing up reading comics and watching cartoons in the 90s, Spider-Man was my number one superhero. I loved all the Marvel characters such as Wolverine, the X-Men, and of course I even like characters like Batman from DC, but my all-time number one, my absolute favourite, was Spider-Man. I was just the right age when this line of toys, these 9-inch action figures from ToyBiz, were released. I absolutely adored them. I loved the fabric costumes, and of course the enhanced articulation and the scale of them were unlike anything that I'd previously owned in my collection, and these toys were just ideal, and having Spider-Man in this line was everything to me. So in this video, I'm going to be taking a look at anything that is essentially a Spider-Man or a Spider-Man variant that was released as part of this line. Now, it probably comes as no surprise that the first release was Spider-Man in his traditional blue and red costume, and the image that they took for the famous cover, of course, was Amazing Fantasy 15, his first appearance. This makes complete sense. It's probably one of the most famous comic book covers of all time, and certainly one of the most valuable. And the overall presentation of the front of the packaging is very nice. We have the spider emblems in the background there, and of course we have the spider web in the top left hand corner. And of course we have a nice illustrated image, a nice illustrated portrait of Spider-Man on the right hand side of the packaging, which is really attractive, very displayable, looks pretty good. Now, one thing you'll notice though is that on the interior, when we open up this inlay, we have a nice image there. I think that's an Eric Larson image of Spider-Man in the top right hand corner there, which is pretty cool. Again, we have the standard bio, but on the right hand side in that window packaging we can see the figure in all its glory, and you might notice that actually rather than being blue they've opted for black, so they've gone for quite a literal interpretation of the famous cover itself and given him that red and black appearance, which I think is a very cool, nice touch, albeit quite a surprising one. Now, I must admit, I never actually owned this version of the figure. However, I do have the very similar but slightly different coloured version of this figure that was released as part of a 2-pack with Electro. Now, I'll take a look at that packaging in the next video when I focus on Electro and some of Spider-Man's villains that were released as part of this line. And instead, for now, I'm going to jump straight into the action figure himself. So hopefully, as you can see, this figure is identical to the standard initial release, except the colouring is very different. Obviously, we have a very vibrant blue instead of that darker black. Now, the first thing to comment on is the fact that his hood is actually sewn into the body of the outfit. So it isn't a separate piece, it's all one piece, but there is some Velcro on the reverse of the hood so that you can take this mask off, and there is a Peter Parker portrait underneath, which is very, very cool. But before we take a look at that, I just wanted to note that this figure can look a little bit clumsy because of this. Maybe it looks a little bit cartoonish and a bit silly, but I have to say there's something very, very pleasing about it in hand. When it's in the flesh, there's something very charming about this figure. It's kind of, I don't know, it's got a magical quality to it. Yes, it's incredibly toyetic, and on screen it can look a little silly, and certainly in certain photographs it looks a little bit clunky and a bit childish, but actually in hand, surprisingly, it has its own magic. The sculpt underneath for Peter Parker, as you can see, you can pull that hood down. I got mixed feelings on this. On the one hand, I think, yeah, it looks like Peter Parker. I think they've done a good job. Certainly Peter Parker from the 90s, I would say, for his appearance, maybe as he's drawn by Mark Bagley, for example. However, there's definitely something slightly off with this. I'm not really keen on the expression on the face. The eyes looking askance slightly up into the top right-hand corner there is a little bit strange. It works in certain circumstances, but overall, I would have preferred a more neutral face and expression, I think. But the costume itself is very, very nicely tailored, I think. The material they've used is quite a thick, luxurious cotton that catches the light quite nicely, so there's a slight gleam to this figure almost, and it is incredibly vibrant and very, very bright. These reds and blues, and the blue in particular is almost like an electric blue. It's very, very vibrant, very colourful, and I really, really like this. Now I think the spider webs and the spider emblem in the centre of the chest there are nicely woven into the costume, they're part of the fabric, and I think this looks pretty good all in all. Sadly, there is a seam in the centre of the waist there, as you can see, which looks a little bit untidy, it doesn't quite marry up with the webs, but if you can overlook this, the rest of it I think is really, really solid. And the big plus for me, the thing I really, really liked about this figure, is the fact that he comes with the underarm webs as well. I think this is a really neat touch and just adds a little bit of something special and extra to this figure. Meanwhile, on the reverse, we can see, of course, they've got the red spider emblem on his back there. You can see where the Velcro line is, where obviously the two pieces of material overlap to sew him in. Yeah, I got mixed feelings. This obviously looks a little bit more clunky. It's a little bit too big, I think, and it doesn't quite marry up 100%. But nevertheless, I think this is a nice touch. I think they've done a good job of it, and it is just painted onto the costume rather than being sewn in. Now, thankfully, one of the advantages of being sewn into one giant body stocking is that they haven't given him those clunky rubber gloves that we've seen on other figures, or the rubber boots. So, of course, we have the benefit here. But again, there's a little bit of clumsiness, I think, in a way, in that you can't see the individual fingers or the fist per se, because it is just essentially cloth wrapped around the hands. So it does look a little bit like giant mittens. The feet definitely fare better in this deal. Again, these are quite nicely rendered. I like how these socks go up to his calves there and meet the blue material nicely and are sewn in. It looks pretty good all in all. The spider webs look nice, and the beauty of this is, of course, he can stand very, very easily, freestanding with no issues of falling over or wobbling or anything like that, which is great. And of course, he looks more in proportion because they haven't given him any big boots or anything like that. So this looks really good. Now, for anyone who's ever owned one of these figures, you'll know what to expect when it comes to the articulation. Spider-Man has a swivel in the neck, meaning he can turn his head from side to side, and there's actually a little bit of a wobble there, so it's not quite a ball joint, but there is a little bit of give to allow him to wobble his head from side to side or forwards and backwards, but it's not a huge range and it's not something you can hold in place. He does have ball jointed shoulders, and these are fantastic because the range of motion on these is really far reaching and go right the way back and right the way up, which is brilliant. He's also got a single jointed elbow, and of course he's got a pin swivel at the wrist there, meaning of course his wrist can rotate 360 degrees, and of course they can arc inwards and outwards as well. Now at the waist there is a ball joint, meaning of course that Spider-Man can rotate 360 degrees, he can move from side to side, and of course he can bend forwards and backwards a little bit as well. He's got ball jointed hips, so the legs do kick out to the sides, they kick forwards, they kick backwards, he's got the single jointed knee, and he's got another swivel pin at the ankle there, meaning his foot can move from side to side and of course hinge forwards and backwards too. So there probably shouldn't be any surprises here when I say I really, really love this figure. Certainly, I think, it's got certain foibles. It is, particularly that mask, the way it's sewn into the costume, I think is a really nice touch, but on the other hand, it does look a little bit clunky and a little bit toyetic, and obviously quite child-friendly. But overall, I think this is a really charming figure. There's a nice quality to this. It's vibrant, it's bright, it's very colourful, and it definitely captures the spirit of what I think of as Spider-Man. There's just something very nice about it and pleasing to have in the collection. Next up, I thought I'd take a look at this exclusive KB Toys release, which was a double deluxe pack featuring Spider-Man in his black costume and Spider-Woman. This was pretty exciting for me at the time because I was a huge fan of the black costume. I thought there was something really cool and interesting about it, so I was really glad to be able to get my hands on this. And I think, in terms of the packaging, the front cover is very, very nice. We can see, obviously, they've utilised the same design for both characters, but with slightly different colouring and shading, and I think this is very effective and looks really quite fun. Now, interestingly, for the famous cover, they've opted for Spectacular Spider-Man issue 126, and I think the chief reason they've chosen this is because this is one of the few covers where we actually see both characters simultaneously on it, which is great. Now I don't think it's particularly a really memorable or particularly famous cover in its own right, but obviously having this qualification makes it a prime candidate. Now, the reverse of the packaging, as you can see, mine is sadly weathered a little bit of damage over the years, has the standard approach that we've seen in the single carded releases, where we have image of each of the characters here. In this case, they look a little bit more exaggerated than usual in terms of their proportions and dimensions, but they're still nice, colourful comic book images, which is pretty cool, and there's a little bit of bio about the two characters and how they met in that issue. And of course, the double gatefold cover opens up there, and we have both those images again on either extreme of the panels, and we can see a little bit of bio about each of the characters, which is cool. And then in the center we have both characters on display in the window packaging. So this is really nice and presentable, very displayable, and it looks appropriately deluxe and fancy. And out of the packaging, looking at the Spider-Man, you can see, of course, they've applied this more or less the same logic in terms of creating that one body stocking for this figure, and he looks really, really good in my opinion. Now, he's not particularly bright or colourful because, of course, it is just a black and white costume, but I think they've done a very nice job of bringing this to life. You might notice this time around, though, the hood actually isn't sewn into the costume. It is a separate piece, so it looks a little bit thinner, a little bit more in proportion this time around, and it looks a little less silly as a result. So I think they've done a really nice job of this. Once again, the eyes have been painted on, but you can now just simply slip off the hood, and it's really cool because there's no tell. It doesn't look floppy or too baggy when it's on his head, and when you pull it off it looks really good. Now, once again, underneath we have the exact same head sculpt as we saw on the previous Peter Parker sculpt, so it is exactly the same, so the same issues apply. I'm not 100% sold on this likeness. I think overall it has a very generic, pretty accurate look for what I think of as Peter Parker, but like I said, having that expression on his face and having him sort of with one raised eyebrow and looking up looks a little bit off to me, and it just kind of distracts. But nevertheless, I do really like that they went to the trouble and the bother of actually having a sculpt underneath it, so you can remove the mask. I think it's a nice idea. Once again, the spider emblem has been sort of painted on, and over time you can see that it starts to flake away. Particularly in my case, as this is one of my all-time favourite figures, so it got well played with when I was much younger. And yeah, you can see he's suffering a little bit there, so something to be aware of, that it will flake over time if through overuse. But nevertheless, it is quite a nice design. Again, we can see this on the back here. I think it's a lot better applied, a lot more in proportion on this figure than the previous one. But nevertheless, on the back we can see, of course, there's still that Velcro seam, which just throws it out ever so slightly. One nice little detail here is the fact that he does have, again, painted on to the backs of his hands the web shooters, so it's quite cool. There's not a lot of other details to pull out of this figure, but the ones that are there I think are really solid, very authentic, and I think they've done a very nice job of it. Overall, I can't really fault this figure too much. I am biased because I had a lot of fun with this as a kid, but I think they've improved on some of the elements of the previous release. I really like that the hood is a separate piece and comes off and he can hold it in his hands like he does here, and I think overall it's a really fun, very pleasing figure. It's got fantastic articulation and it looks great. Moving on to the Spider-Woman, this is a real surprise entry into the list because she's one of the lesser known or lower tier characters in the Marvel Universe. When a lot of the big hitters never got a release, it's really cool that this character did, and I think the overall design is really very nice. Now, you'll notice, because it's unavoidable, that they have opted to give her the doll hair rather than a hard plastic. Now, as I've said in other videos, this can be hit or miss depending on the figure. Now, I have to say, I think this is one of the ones where it works quite well. Now, obviously, that's with the caveat of understanding that this figure has been well played with. As I said, this set was one of my favourites as a child growing up, so it maybe hasn't stood the test of time as well as others. So by this point, her hair does look a little bit straggly, a little bit unkempt. But I can tell you that when I first opened it, I remember very clearly that this was really neat and looked really very good. So I think this is one of the better attempts of using this, and it looks quite good when it's new. Now, also, she does have the removable mask, which again I think is a really nice touch. They've opted to go to that little extra detail, so you can pull the mask down, it just slides down over her face, and we can see the head sculpt underneath. Now, this looks very familiar to me. I think this may well, in fact, be the Jean Grey sculpt or the Dark Phoenix sculpt with the eyes painted in. I think this is a good sculpt. I think it's very striking, nicely painted. The only criticism I might have is that the eyes seem a little bit too piercing, a little bit too strong. The tailoring on the costume is once again very nicely done. Just as we saw with the Spider-Man before, of course the spider emblem is painted on, but you'll notice she also has the gloves, the long sleeve gloves. So again, none of those clunky rubber gloves. These are the nice faux leather effect gloves which slide up to the arms, which are great. The only danger with these is obviously over time, with overuse, they will start to flake and fall apart a little bit. So sadly, mine are in that state right now. But again, looks really good, brand new. And once again, we have the spider emblem painted onto the back there, and of course it has that similar issue with the Velcro in the seam. I think it probably works a little better on Spider-Woman because she's obviously a smaller frame, so the seam is slightly thinner, but nevertheless, it is still a little bit clunky. For the knee-high boots, they've employed the same tactic they've used on some of the X-Men female characters as well, where they've basically sculpted the boot in a hard, in this case, white plastic, which is a pretty decent sculpt. She can stand up okay in this, not too many problems here in terms of balance. But then they've created a faux leather slip that goes up to create the rest of the effect of the boot. Obviously, tonally, you can see the slightly different colours being used here. They don't quite match up. And the other danger, of course, with this faux leather is, as I said before, they can flake off and sadly degrade over time. In terms of articulation, it is pretty much exactly the same as we saw on the Spider-Man. She has a ball-jointed neck, and I always think in the female characters this works a lot better. So she has a much greater range of motion, so the head can look up and down properly, it can move to the side, and generally just a much better range of motion, which is fantastic. She's got the ball-jointed shoulders, and again, no hindrance here. The arms can go right the way backwards, they can go right the way up, which is absolutely fantastic. And she's got the single-jointed elbow, and of course the pin swivel at the wrist there as well. So this is all really solid stuff and fantastic. Likewise, she's also got that ball joint in the waist as well, so again she can rotate right the way around, she can arc from side to side and bend forwards and backwards with no problems whatsoever. She's also got the ball jointed hips. Of course, the legs kick out, they kick forwards, they kick backwards, and they're all supported with the single jointed knee as well, so they bend to about 90 degrees, which looks really very good. And then finally there is another pin swivel at the ankle there, so again the feet do hinge forwards, backwards and rotate from side to side. All in all, a very, very nice figure and a welcome addition to this collection. I think they've done a nice job of the presentation. I think everything about this figure works quite well. Sadly, over time, I think there's certain elements that work against it. The faux leather, the hair, obviously, if they're not well kept and maintained over the years, they are going to fall apart a little bit in these places. So that's on me in this case, but the actual figure itself, I think, is absolutely fantastic. But that's not the end of the story, because they did release one more Spider-Man related character, and that was of course Spider-Girl, which for those who are fans of the comic series will know that they basically adapted the Ben Reilly outfit and it was given to a sort of future, maybe alternate universe version of Spider-Man's daughter. I never own this one myself, it's another one on my to buy list, but this looks really very cool. I think overall the packaging looks quite nice, the images that they've used, it's what we've come to know and love from this series so far, but I think it's very effective and looks really fun. I believe the famous cover they went with was actually issue 0 of Spider-Girl. I could be mistaken on that, but obviously it is probably one of the more famous Spider-Girl covers, and obviously it does show it in all the glory, so this makes perfect sense to go with this cover. Now, it's often difficult to judge a figure based on photographs or videos until you've actually had them in hand yourself, but from what I can tell, this looks like a pretty nice figure. We can see, obviously, it has the fabric costume, but also has the plastic gauntlets there for the web shooters, which I think is a nice touch. The spider design looks to be pretty much perfect, like in a nice proportion, looks pretty good. She has the removable mask with a pretty decent head sculpt underneath, which I think is kind of fun. The mask itself maybe looks a little bit too big, a little bit too large from the photos I've seen, but again, very difficult to tell from here. But all in all, I think this looks like a pretty nice, fun figure for the collection. So all in all then, a pretty nice set. It's probably not the most comprehensive set since these days when these figures were released. Obviously there's been a whole range of different Spider-Man costumes and alternate versions of Spider-Man that they probably might have employed if they were making them today. But as it was, these are pretty much the only versions of Spider-Man that were out there at the time. Maybe the exception might have been Spider-Man 2099. That would have been a really cool addition actually. But sadly he never made it to the roster. But that said, these figures themselves are really very, very nice. I actually think these are some of my favourites. They're just really vibrant and colourful. They definitely, make the benefit of all that articulation. I just think they look really good on display as well. There's something very fun and toyetic about this collection that I really, really like. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.